This is Political Conversation, an occasional feature on poststar.com. I'm Maury Thompson. Today, I'm speaking with U.S. Representative Chris Gibson about legislation he introduced recently dealing with declaration of war. So, Congressman, tell me about your legislation that you introduced dealing with the War Powers Act.
Yeah. First of all, Maury, good to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity. The legislation that we introduced, the War Powers Reform Act, is designed to bring balance back to the critical question on use of force. And you look at what the founders, this was a topic that was near and dear to the founders' heart. They certainly had the experience, the searing experience of dealing with King George, and what they wanted to have with our republic was a situation where separate institutions shared power. That way you had checks and balances, and so they took careful consideration. And this, you look at the notes on the Constitution, that's James Madison's notes, and then you look at the Federalist Papers, which are Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, and they discuss this in great detail. I point you to, in particular, Federalist Papers 69 and 70. You can read more about it. But what they envisioned, and particularly in 69, was the president, there would be energy in the executive, as the founders were concerned about, coming out of the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. There would be energy in the executive, and the president would be the commander-in-chief, but that the people's representatives, the Congress, would decide when we would use force. So, that of course was instantiated in the Constitution, those specific provisions. But over time, in the 20th century, what has happened, particularly in the aftermath since World War II, is the president has acted unilaterally in introducing forces into hostile situations. And so, look, the Libyan situation is only the latest example. There have been examples from presidents from both political parties who have taken our country to war or to hostile situations without the consent of the American people. So what we're trying to do is bring clarity to a situation with the War Powers Reform Act that provides more specificity on when the president can act in his role as commander-in-chief. And so those provisions are declaration of war. The second is by statute, by authorization from the American people by way of their representatives from Congress. That could be a use of force, all necessary means statute, legislation, which you've seen in previous conflicts, or it can be attendant to obligation, obligation by treaty. Now that's an important point, because not all treaties provide an obligation on the American people to react. And why that's important is that the founders also saw moments when the American people may want to enter treaties. Now, it was a very controversial topic back then. In fact, the first president, President Washington, eschewed that and had great concerns. But the founders wanted to have that provision in there. And so what we should recognize as the American people is going forward, that if we give our word by way of a treaty, that binding treaty has far and wide implications. So I think that should also be more of our consciousness, is that we're very careful and deliberate about entering treaties, and that it's also every generation should take a look at the treaties on the books and see if we still feel that that's in our best interest to continue to have. So again, it's declaration of war, statute, including obligations under treaty, and then finally an attack on the United States, or an imminent threat of attack. Now, imminent threat not being the lead up to the Gulf War, and nor be the lead up to the Iraq War of 2003. And you'll recall that we had actually authorization for both of those, but that would not be an example of imminent threat. Imminent threat would be more an example of what happened in Times Square in the previous summer. That would be an example of something that is an attack that's in the offing that the president can take action. Now, not meeting any of those stipulations, if the president thought it was in the best interest of the American people to use force, he would have to come to the Congress first for authorization. So situations, for example, like Libya, if the president felt like that was something the American people should do, that in addition to consulting with the United Nations, the Arab League, and with NATO, the president would have to come to the Congress and get authorization before he could obligate or expend any funds.
Do you have any co-sponsors of that proposed legislation?
We do. Now, this was just put in the hopper on our last day, and Steve Stivers from Ohio has already signed on. I've talked to a number of members, and I look forward to, when we get back from this district work period, continuing to work that issue. Look, this is an issue I think that should be certainly bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans looking at this stipulation, this reform, as necessary to bring balance back to the very solemn question as to whether or not we use force.
Thanks for watching. Watch later this week for parts 2 and 3. And remember, you can always keep up to date on local politics news at the All Politics is Local blog on poststar.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at ps_politics.